What if I told you that the single most important thing you could do for your long-term health, the thing that could literally add years, maybe even decades to your life, was not some cutting-edge biohack, not a 300 supplement stack, not even a grueling high-intensity workout? What if the answer was something that looked, from the outside, almost embarrassingly easy? Something so low-key that people walking past you at the gym might wonder if you're even trying. That's exactly what Peter Attia, one of the most respected longevity physicians in the world, has been saying for years. And once you understand the science behind it, once you really get what's happening inside your body when you do this, you are never going to look at your training the same way again. Today, we are going deep on Zone 2 training, what it is, why Peter Attia is obsessed with it, how he actually uses it himself, and most importantly, how you can use it to build a longer, healthier, more capable life. This is not a quick overview. This is the full guide. So if you're serious about your health and your longevity, stay with me, because this might be the most important hour you spend all week. Let's start at the beginning, because before we can talk about Zone 2, we need to talk about Peter Attia himself and why his perspective carries so much weight. Peter Attia is a physician who spent years training in surgery at Johns Hopkins before shifting his entire focus to longevity medicine. He's not the kind of doctor who just reads studies and relays information. He experiments on himself relentlessly. He digs into the primary literature with an almost obsessive intensity, and he thinks about health in a fundamentally different way than most people in mainstream medicine. His whole framework is built around what he calls Medicine 3.0, which is this idea that instead of waiting until you're sick and then treating disease, you should be playing offense decades in advance, building the physiological foundation that makes you resilient, capable, and full of life well into your 70s, 80s, and beyond. And when Peter Attia started identifying the tools that actually move the needle on longevity, the interventions that are backed by real evidence and that he trusts enough to build his own life around, Zone 2 training kept rising to the top. He's talked about it on his podcast, The Drive, in great detail. He's interviewed some of the world's leading exercise physiologists about it. He's written about it, tracked his own numbers obsessively, and structured his weekly training around it. This is not a casual interest for him. Zone 2 is a cornerstone. So what exactly is Zone 2? Your body has different ways of producing energy, and depending on how hard you're working, it leans on different systems. At rest, and at very light efforts, your body is primarily burning fat. As you start working harder, the intensity climbs, and at some point, a point that varies by individual but has a specific physiological signature, your body starts shifting away from fat burning and toward burning glucose. It starts producing lactate faster than it can clear it. Your breathing becomes labored. The work starts feeling hard. That transition point is called the lactate threshold, and Zone 2 training is the effort level just below it. Here's why that matters. When you're working in Zone 2, just under that lactate threshold, you are in this incredibly productive metabolic sweet spot. You are burning predominantly fat for fuel. You are doing it aerobically, meaning with oxygen, which is the cleanest and most efficient way your body produces energy. Your mitochondria, those tiny organelles inside your cells that are responsible for producing ATP, for keeping you alive and functioning, are working hard but not being overwhelmed. And here's the key insight that Peter Attia keeps coming back to when you train consistently in this zone. you are directly building and improving mitochondrial function. Mitochondria are not a fixed resource. You can grow more of them, a process called mitochondrial biogenesis, and you can improve the quality and efficiency of the ones you already have. Zone 2 training is one of the most powerful stimuli we know of for doing exactly that. More mitochondria, better mitochondria, mitochondria that are more efficient at using fat as a fuel, that produce less oxidative stress, that are more resilient over time. This is not abstract biology. This is the difference between a 70-year-old who can still hike mountains and one who gets winded walking up a flight of stairs. Now, Peter Attia talks about 4 primary pillars of longevity: exercise, nutrition, sleep, and what he calls the emotional and mental health piece. And within exercise, he breaks it down further into different types: strength training, stability work, and cardiovascular training. Zone 2 is the foundation of his cardiovascular training. He said publicly that if he could only keep one form of exercise in his life, cardiovascular training, and specifically Zone 2, would be the hardest to give up because its benefits are so broad and so foundational. Let me give you a sense of how sweeping those benefits actually are, because I think people underestimate this. The first and maybe most important benefit is metabolic health. When Peter Attia thinks about the diseases that are most likely to kill people or dramatically reduce their quality of life, cardiovascular disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, type 2 diabetes and its complications, he sees metabolic dysfunction as a common thread running through almost all of them. Insulin resistance, dysfunctional glucose metabolism, poor fat oxidation. These are not just problems in themselves, they are upstream causes that make almost every chronic disease worse. And Zone 2 training is one of the most potent tools we have for improving metabolic health. When you train your body to burn fat efficiently, when you improve your mitochondrial function, when you increase your insulin sensitivity, you are pulling that thread. You are addressing the root. The second benefit is cardiovascular health. And here we're talking about something very specific. Peter pays enormous attention to a metric called VO2 max, which is the maximum amount of oxygen your body can consume and use during intense exercise. It is the single best predictor of all cause mortality we have in the exercise literature. People in the top quartile of VO2 max for their age have something like 5 times lower risk of dying over any given period compared to people in the bottom quartile. 5 times, that is a bigger effect size than almost any drug or intervention in medicine. And while very high intensity work is what directly tests VO2 max, Zone 2 training builds the aerobic base, the engine that everything else sits on. You cannot build a high VO2 max without a strong aerobic base. Zone 2 is how you build that base. Third is what Peter calls the importance of fat oxidation specifically. One of the things he tracks closely in his own training is the maximum rate at which his body can burn fat. How many grams of fat per minute can he oxidize during exercise? This matters enormously because fat is an almost limitless fuel source in the body, and the ability to rely on it means sparing glycogen, maintaining steadier energy levels, and supporting all kinds of metabolic processes that affect everything from cognitive function to mood. A highly trained Zone 2 athlete can burn fat at rates that an untrained person simply cannot. And the way you train that capacity is through consistent Zone 2 work. Fourth is longevity at the cellular level. Here we're back to mitochondria, but let's go a level deeper. As we age, mitochondrial function declines. This is one of the hallmarks of aging. It's on the list of biological processes that researchers believe are most central to why we age and why age. related disease develops. When you do Zone 2 training consistently over years and decades, you are working directly against that decline. You are not just maintaining mitochondrial function, you are actively improving it. Peter has cited research by exercise physiologist Iñigo Millán, with whom he's done multiple deep dive podcast episodes, showing that elite endurance athletes who've trained for decades have mitochondrial profiles that look physiologically much younger than their chronological age. That is not coincidence. That is the adaptation. So now you're probably wondering, okay, but what does Zone 2 actually feel like? How do you know if you're in it? This is where people get confused, and it's important to get right, because Zone 2 is specific. If you're going too easy, you're not getting the stimulus. If you're going too hard, you've left Zone 2 and you're in a metabolic no man's land that isn't delivering the same benefits. Peter Attia uses a few different ways to define and find Zone 2. The most precise method is a lactate meter. You prick your finger during exercise, measure blood lactate levels, and Zone 2 is roughly the effort where your lactate is in the range about 1.7 to 2.0 millimoles per liter. That's the range where fat oxidation is maximized and you're just below the point where lactate starts to accumulate significantly. Peter actually does this. He has a lactate meter. He calibrates his effort against it, and he uses those readings to make sure he's actually training in the zone he thinks he's training in. But most people don't have lactate meters, and Peter acknowledges that. So there's a practical proxy that works reasonably well, the talk test. Zone 2 should be an effort where you can hold a conversation, where you could speak in full sentences if someone were talking to you. But it's not comfortable. You're working. You're breathing more than normal. You wouldn't want to sing, but you could talk. If you're so breathless you can only grunt out single words, you've gone too hard. If you could carry on a completely effortless monologue for an hour, you might not be working hard enough. Another way to think about it, Peter describes Zone 2 as the highest intensity at which you can still keep your breathing under control, where the conversation is possible but slightly labored. It's often described as a 3 or 4 out of 10 on a perceived exertion scale. But here's the trick. For trained people, what feels like a 3 might actually be a much higher absolute intensity than what a centenary person experiences at the same subjective effort. Training in Zone 2 over time literally shifts what Zone 2 feels like, which is part of the adaptation. Heart rate is another marker people use, and while it's imperfect because it varies so much by individual, a rough heuristic that Peter has mentioned is that for many people, Zone 2 falls somewhere in the range of 60 to 70% of maximum heart rate. But he's quick to say that using heart rate as your primary guide is less accurate than lactate testing or the talk test, because heart rate can be affected by heat, stress, caffeine, hydration, and many other factors. Now let's talk about how Peter Attia actually structures his Zone 2 training, because this is where it gets really practical. Peter has talked about training 4 to 5 days per week, with cardiovascular training being a significant chunk of that. His general recommendation for Zone 2, and what he does himself, is roughly 3 to 4 hours per week, spread across multiple sessions. He's mentioned doing sessions of 45 minutes to an hour, sometimes longer, usually at least 3 times a week. And he's been consistent about this for years, not just weeks or months. This is not a seasonal thing for Peter. It is as foundational to his life as sleep. For the modality, what you actually do during Zone 2, Peter is not dogmatic. The exercise science doesn't care if you're on a bike, a rower, running, doing an elliptical or hiking. What matters is the metabolic demand, the heart rate and lactate response, not the specific movement. Peter himself has done a lot of Zone 2 on a stationary bike and on an incline treadmill. He finds cycling particularly good because it's easier to control intensity precisely, it's low impact on the joints, and it's easy to sustain for longer periods without breaking form or focus. He's also a fan of what he calls low stress Zone 2, meaning he'll sometimes do it while watching something or listening to podcasts because the effort level is sustained but not so demanding that you need total concentration. One thing Peter is very clear about, Zone 2 is not the same as easy cardio. This is a common misconception. People who are highly trained, really serious athletes, often find Zone 2 genuinely challenging to stay in because their fitness is high enough that they naturally want to push harder. The discipline is in staying at the right intensity, not pushing above it. For less trained individuals, Zone 2 might feel genuinely easy at first, but over time, as fitness improves, you can do more work at the same relative intensity, which is the whole point. There's another component to Peter's cardiovascular training that complements Zone 2, and that's high-intensity interval work, what he calls Zone 5, which is maximum effort intervals. He typically does one session a week of VO2 max intervals, which are short, brutally hard efforts that push your cardiovascular system to its absolute ceiling. These two ends of the intensity spectrum, Zone 2 and Zone 5, are what he considers the most important for longevity, and he's deliberately light on the middle, the moderate intensity sustained effort stuff that a lot of recreational exercisers default to, that slightly uncomfortable but not really hard pace that doesn't fully develop the aerobic base and doesn't stress the system enough to drive VO2 max improvements. He calls this junk miles or middle zone training, and his view is that it delivers less return on time invested than the polarized approach of Zone 2 plus high intensity work. But today is about Zone 2, so let's stay focused. Why does Zone 2 specifically matter for longevity and not just fitness? Let me try to really land this point because I think it's easy to hear, do more cardio, and think you already know what that means. This is different. When Peter talks about the goal of longevity training, he's not just talking about living longer in a quantity of years sense. He's talking about what he calls the marginal decade, the last decade of your life. He wants people to be thinking not just about lifespan, but about what he terms health span, the quality and capability of the years you live. And when he imagines what a great last decade looks like, he describes it in very physical terms. Can you pick up a grandchild? Can you carry your own luggage through an airport without stopping to rest? Can you hike, travel, play, move through the world with agency and physical capability? These things require a foundation of cardiovascular fitness, metabolic health, and muscular capacity that does not happen by accident. It happens because you built it, deliberately, consistently, over decades. Zone 2 training is central to that foundation because it builds the aerobic engine that powers everything. Every physical activity you do in life, walking, climbing stairs, playing with kids, gardening, carrying groceries, draws on your aerobic system. The more developed that system is, the easier all of life feels, the more reserve you have, and the more resilient you are to the metabolic and cardiovascular challenges that come with aging. There's also a direct connection between Zone 2 training and cognitive health, which is something Peter discusses with increasing frequency. The brain is arguably the most metabolically active organ in the body. It depends on mitochondrial function, on good blood flow, on glucose and lactate metabolism. Research increasingly shows that regular aerobic exercise is one of the most powerful interventions we know of for brain health, reducing the risk of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. And the mechanisms are largely the same mechanisms that Zone 2 training improves: mitochondrial function, metabolic health, vascular health, neuroplasticity. When you're improving your mitochondria through Zone 2, you're improving your brain's mitochondria too. Now let's address the most common questions and obstacles people run into when they try to actually implement Zone 2 training. The first one is, I'm fit. I run or do CrossFit regularly, but when I try to do Zone 2, it feels impossibly slow. My heart rate won't stay down unless I'm practically walking. What's going on? This is incredibly common, and it's actually revealing something important. What it usually means is that your cardiovascular base, your aerobic fitness specifically, is less developed than your ability to handle high-intensity work. A lot of people who train hard at high intensities have developed muscular fitness and capacity to produce power, but they haven't built the underlying aerobic engine efficiently. They've been training in that middle zone we talked about, not easy enough to be Zone 2, not hard enough to be true high intensity, and their body has adapted to getting through workouts without ever really developing the fat-burning machinery. When they try to drop to Zone 2, it feels stupidly slow because their aerobic efficiency is low. Iñigo Millán calls this carbohydrate dependency, the reliance on glucose and glycogen, even at moderate intensities. Zone 2 training fixes this, but you have to be patient. For some people, it takes months before they can run at a pace that feels athletic while staying in Zone 2. The second obstacle is time. 3 to 4 hours a week sounds like a lot, especially if you already have a busy life. What does Peter say about this? His honest answer is that some Zone 2 is vastly better than none, and the dose-response curve is such that the first couple hours of Zone 2 per week deliver enormous returns. If you can't do 4 hours, do 2. If you can't do 2, do 1.5. The key is consistency over time, not perfection in any single week. He also points out that Zone 2 is uniquely compatible with multitasking. You can listen to podcasts, watch shows, take calls. It doesn't demand your full cognitive attention the way heavy lifting or complex skill work does. So in some ways, it's easier to stack into a busy life than more demanding training. The third obstacle is boredom. An hour on a stationary bike at a pace that feels easy can be monotonous for people who are used to the dopamine hit of hard training. Peter talks about this openly. He said the psychological challenge of Zone 2 is real. It doesn't feel heroic. It doesn't give you that sense of having suffered and earned something. But he's also made the philosophical point that part of what makes Zone 2 valuable is precisely that it's not a maximum stress event. The goal isn't to crush your body and recover. The goal is to apply a consistent, sustainable stimulus that builds something slowly over years. That requires a different mindset than the go hard or go home culture of a lot of fitness communities. Learning to appreciate the slow build, to find satisfaction in consistency rather than intensity, is itself part of the adaptation mentally. The fourth question is about nutrition around Zone 2. Specifically, what should you eat before, during, and after? Peter's approach here is nuanced and has evolved over the years. He's experimented with fasted Zone 2, doing the session without eating beforehand, because fasted training can further drive fat oxidation and metabolic adaptation. When you're fasted, your glycogen stores are somewhat depleted, and your body is even more inclined to use fat as fuel during the session. He's done extended periods where he did zone 2, fasted consistently, and tracked his fat oxidation rates to see how they changed. That said, he's not dogmatic about it. For longer sessions, eating normally is fine. The goal during zone 2 is always to stay in the zone, to maintain that appropriate intensity, and if being underfueled causes you to feel terrible or perform poorly, it's defeating the purpose. During zone 2 sessions, he doesn't typically consume sugary gels or sports drinks the way an endurance athlete might for a long race. The whole point is fat burning, and spiking insulin mid-session works against that. After zone 2, normal recovery nutrition applies. Fifth question, how does zone 2 interact with the rest of your training? Does it interfere with strength training? Peter does both, and his framework is that they serve different purposes and together build a more complete physiological foundation. His strength training is primarily oriented around what he thinks will matter most in the marginal decade: the ability to carry things, to get up off the floor, to maintain muscle mass against the natural tide of sarcopenia that comes with aging. Zone 2 builds the metabolic and cardiovascular engine. These aren't competing. If anything, good aerobic fitness supports recovery from strength training and vice versa. He generally structures his week so that very hard training days don't pile on top of each other. He'll spread his zone 2 sessions and his strength sessions across the week with adequate recovery between them. Now, I want to zoom out for a moment and talk about something that I think makes Peter Attia's approach to zone 2 and to exercise in general so different from mainstream fitness culture. Most fitness culture is oriented around a relatively short time horizon. How do you look in summer? How do you perform in your next race? How do you optimize the next 8 weeks? Peter's framework is oriented around a 50-year time horizon. Literally, he thinks about what a 75 or 80-year-old version of himself will need to be capable of, and then he works backward from there to figure out what he needs to be doing now. He calls it training for the centenarian Olympics. This mental model of imagining a series of physical tests you'd want to pass at the end of your life, and then training toward those goals decades in advance. Through that lens, zone 2 makes perfect sense. It's not exciting. It doesn't transform your body in 8 weeks, but it builds something that compounds over time: mitochondrial density, metabolic efficiency, cardiovascular reserve, in a way that accumulates across decades. The 70-year-old who has been doing 3 to 4 hours of zone 2 a week for 20 years has a completely different physiological profile than the one who hasn't. And that difference translates directly into capability, independence, and quality of life. There's also a risk reduction component that Peter talks about. High-intensity training done repeatedly without adequate base training carries real injury risk. Overuse injuries, stress fractures, connective tissue damage. These are real costs that compound over time. Zone 2, being lower impact and lower intensity, is something you can do consistently without accumulating the kind of physical wear that forces breaks and interruptions. Consistency, in Peter's view, is often more important than intensity. A person who does zone 2 4 times a week for 20 years has accumulated a training adaptation that occasional high-intensity bursts will never match. Let me also address what the science actually says about the longevity benefits, because Peter is deeply evidence-based and he wants people to understand why he's making these recommendations, not just take them on faith. The epidemiological data on cardiorespiratory fitness and mortality is extraordinary. Studies following large populations over decades consistently show that higher VO2 max and higher levels of cardiorespiratory fitness are associated with dramatically lower all-cause mortality, lower cardiovascular disease risk, lower cancer mortality, lower rates of cognitive decline. And crucially, the relationship is not linear. The biggest gains come from moving from very unfit to moderately fit, meaning even if you're starting from a low base, improving your aerobic fitness even modestly has massive returns. The mechanistic data supports this. Studies by Iñigo, Millán, and others show that Zone 2 type training directly improves mitochondrial biogenesis, fat oxidation capacity, lactate clearance, and metabolic flexibility. Animal studies have shown that endurance exercise, the kind that mimics what Zone 2 does in terms of metabolic demand, literally extends lifespan. Human studies can't ethically prove causation in the same way, but the mechanisms are understood and consistent. Peter also cites the work on METs, metabolic equivalence, which is a standardized way of measuring fitness. The relationship between METs and all-cause mortality is one of the strongest associations in the medical literature. MET improvement in fitness is associated with about a 10 to 15% reduction in all-cause mortality risk. When you accumulate Zone 2 training over years, you are incrementally improving that MET score. You are, in a very real and measurable sense, shifting your risk profile for every major disease category. So let me bring this all the way back to something practical. If you've watched this far and you want to start, what does week 1 look like? Peter's answer, and mine, is to start by finding your Zone 2. Don't worry about volume yet. Get on a bike or a treadmill or go for a walk, jog, and figure out what effort level keeps you just below the conversation threshold. Breathing harder than normal, but able to speak in full sentences, do that for 30 to 45 minutes. Do it 3 times in week 1. That's it. Don't try to go longer. Don't push harder. Just find the zone and practice staying in it. In week 2 and 3, you can extend the sessions slightly or add a 4th session. The goal in the first month is to build the habit and develop your sense of where Zone 2 is for your body. It shifts as your fitness improves, and that's the whole point. You're training your body to do more work at the same metabolic cost. If you want to be more precise, consider getting a lactate meter. Peter has talked about the brands he uses. They're relatively affordable, and the test strips are inexpensive. Testing yourself periodically during training will give you real data on where your lactate is and whether you're actually in the zone. For most people, this level of precision is optional but genuinely useful if you're serious about optimizing. Track your sessions. Note the heart rate, the duration, the modality, how it felt. Over time, and I mean over months and years, you will start to see something remarkable. The pace or power output at which you can sustain Zone 2 will increase. You'll be able to run faster or bike harder while keeping your heart rate and lactate in the same zone. That is direct evidence of improved mitochondrial function and aerobic efficiency. That is the adaptation made visible. And here's the thing that I want you to hold on to as we close: the people who are most vital, most capable, most fully inhabiting their lives at 70 and 80 are not the people who worked the hardest in their 30s. They're the people who were the most consistent. Consistency over intensity. Decades over months. Process over outcomes. Peter Attia talks about his patients who are in their 60s and 70s and how clearly he can see in their physiology, in their VO2 max, in their metabolic markers, the difference between those who trained consistently for decades and those who didn't. It's not subtle. It's the difference between a body that's aging gracefully, and one that's in accelerated decline. And it's not too late. The research is clear that the benefits of Zone 2 training are available at any age. Starting at 50 or 60 still makes an enormous difference, but starting now, whatever age you are, is the best decision you can make. Zone 2 is not flashy. It will not give you a six-pack. It will not help you lift more in the gym next month. It will give you something better and rarer, a physiological foundation that makes you capable, resilient, and alive in every sense of the word for as long as you can possibly be. Peter Attia has built his longevity practice on this. He's built his own training life around it. And the more you understand the science, the mitochondria, the metabolic health, the VO2 max, the cellular aging, the more obvious it becomes that this is not optional. This is the work. The quiet, consistent, unsexy, life-changing work. If this video opened something up for you, if you're going to go for a Zone 2 walk tomorrow, or dust off that stationary bike, or start tracking your heart rate on your next jog, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're starting from and where you want to go. And if you want to go deeper on any of this, the specific protocols, the nutrition, how Zone 2 interacts with strength training, or how Peter Attia thinks about the other pillars of longevity, those videos are coming. Subscribe so you don't miss them. This stuff matters. Your future self is counting on what you do today. Let's get to work.